All right, welcome everyone. We are glad to have you here for our panel event entitled "The Road to Racial Equality in the Workplace." As many of you know, this is the culminating event for our third Common Read program. So many of you read Diversity Inc. And this is our third Common Read, but our first in-person culminating event. So we're very excited to have you here. For those of you experiencing the panel through our global classroom, we would encourage you to keep your cameras on. We are in our brand new global classroom, so the back wall is actually all of your beautiful faces, and we'd love to see them if you can turn your cameras on. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Jill Perry-Smith. She is a professor of organization and management and our senior associate dean of strategic initiatives and the moderator for our event today. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I have the honor and privilege of moderating this esteemed panel. I'll start with brief introductions and have a series of questions to engage our panelists in conversation. And we will be sure to leave time for your questions because we want to know what's on your mind, what you have to say, and what you want to know about. So first, I'll start with Frank Dobbin, who is the Henry Ford Professor of the Social Sciences and Chair of the Department of Sociology at Harvard University. His Inventing Equal Opportunity book shows how HR managers and activists defined what it meant to discriminate in the eyes of the law. His current book, new as of September 2022, Getting to Diversity, What Works and What Doesn't with Alexandra Caleb, looks at the effectiveness of dozens of different diversity programs in over 800 companies across more than 30 years to answer the question that we all want to know: which programs help, which hurt, and how can harmful programs be improved? Frank, welcome. Qaadirah Abdur-Rahim is the City of Atlanta's Chief Equity Officer, a senior level cabinet position. Qaadirah led the legislative process to establish the city's first Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Before joining the city, Qaadirah worked to break the cycle of generational poverty for nearly 17 years at Future Foundation, departing as the organization's CEO. And during her time, Future Foundation experienced tremendous growth in all realms, in revenue, service locations, and students involved. She graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, and earned an MBA from our beloved Goizueta Business School.
All right.
Andrew Davis is the Executive Vice President and Global Chief People Experience Officer at Sony Music Entertainment. His spheres of influence include talent acquisition, talent management, as well as organizational development and corporate strategy. Throughout his 22-plus year history in human resources, Andrew has held key positions in top corporations, including Best Buy Company, the Home Depot, and most recently serving as Chief Human Resources and Inclusion Officer at Lanier Corporation. He spent more than a decade at the Coca-Cola Company. There he served as Global Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, driving strategic DE&I initiatives across 200-plus countries. Andrew is a graduate of Washington Adventist University and earned an MBA from our beloved Goizueta. And Pamela Newkirk. The reason that we're here today, Pamela is a journalist, professor, and author. Her work broadly examines contemporary and historical depictions of African Americans in popular culture. Her book, Our Common Read, Diversity Inc., The Failed Promise of a Billion-Dollar Business, was included on Time Magazine's Most Read Books of 2019 and featured in numerous publications, too many to name, but including Forbes, Fortune, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, etc. Her previous book, Spectacle, The Astonishing Life of Ota Benga, was awarded the 2016 NAACP Image Award and was selected as a New York Times Editor's Choice. In addition, the book was named a Best Book of 2015 by several outlets, again, too numerous to name, including NPR, the Boston Globe, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Pamela is on faculty at New York University. She holds journalism degrees from Columbia and NYU, and a PhD from Columbia University.
But I feel bad, I didn't know.
Let's welcome Pamela. So I'd like to start with a question for Pamela regarding the book. Of course, the primary aim of the book exposes the decades-old practices that have made diversity a lucrative business, yet at the same time failing to achieve diversity. So Pamela, tell us why you wrote the book and what was the most surprising or impactful thing that you learned while writing it?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's been such an honor to meet with some of your brilliant students. We were blown away by our conversation with your student leaders today. And I'm honored that Diversity Inc. was selected as your common read and also to be joined by this remarkably esteemed panel. So thank you, and thank you for the lovely introduction. So in writing Diversity Inc., I wanted to interrogate the tension between this incessant conversation we have about diversity and the multi-billion-dollar business that's blossomed around the diversity industry and the lack of diversity. I wanted to examine why it was that after 50 years of these conversations and my own experience being part of this conversation, being the only African-American journalist at 3 or 4 newsrooms I worked at, being the only tenured African-American professor in the entire Faculty of Arts and Science at New York University. And yet, we keep talking about diversity, we keep having these same conversations. So I wanted to look at the data and also to look at what institutions were doing right and what they were doing wrong, and how we can disrupt the tired conversations that we have about diversity without making any progress towards diversity.
Thank you. Let's start with Andrew next. Talk to us about what inspired your entree from a professional perspective in the DEI space.
Yeah, I'll go back a little bit, way back, but I'll do a very short version. And when I was working, before I got into HR, I was working in restaurant management and had a pretty good career track going, and thought that, the goal was to just ride the ladder in restaurant management and operations. But there was always something missing, I felt, from very early on, and probably in my 20s as I was getting to undergrad and what have you, that itch kept getting heavier and heavier, and that gut in the belly saying that there's something missing. I don't think this is a track for you. Love business, but I had a fascination with just human nature and how people think and how you get the most out of people and use their full potentials. And couldn't articulate it at the time, but for me, it was like that was a missing link. And a number of things happened, but I think the most important thing for me was when I met a head of HR while I was working at Pizza Hut back then in operations. And they told me what they did. I'm like, that's the job. I knew it then instantly, and I pursued that heavily. As the career progressed, and diversity inclusion was always part of our remit within HR, when I got into the CDO role at Coke, it was more of the role found me than I found the role. I had this, this is a safe place, right? So I always said I would never be a chief diversity officer, never. Not because it's such a bad job, but because I thought that I could impact more at the HR level than the CDO level. And I also thought that, for what I needed to do, it would just be a difficult thing to have that be a one-person show, and that's what it was at the time. I'm like, I need a team. Anyway, that went all the window, and it was more, when my leader came to me and said, hey, look, this is what I want you to do. I said, you sure you want me in this? Because I'll disrupt the heck out of this. You ready for that? Because I'm gonna do it much differently than anyone else, because like you, I'm tired of just having a conversation. We're gonna be about it, not talk about it. And so, once we had that conversation and we talked to the board and they were ready for that, I took the job on graciously, and it was a terrific role, and happy I did it. I think it's still in me, because I'm all about, especially growing up as an immigrant, you think about fairness and equity, certainly in terms of when you're experiencing not as much, you're more feeling the pain of it. But now as a professional, I think about that in terms of fairness, equity, and inclusion for everyone, especially coming in with that lens. So it's something that's was kind of embedded in me early, and I think it's all made sense now in terms of what I do for my career.
Thank you. Qaadirah, tell us what inspired your entree into this space in the government and public sector realm.
So I'm from Atlanta, born and raised here, first gen college grad. My parents told my 4 siblings and I that you all will go to college on athletic scholarships, and we did. So when I graduated high school, I had the amazing opportunity to attend the University of California, Berkeley. From there, I joined the Air Force Reserves my sophomore year of college, went on to graduate from the University of San Francisco, and then eventually Emory. And I don't share those educational experiences to be braggadocious. I share those experiences because that was the first time that through all of those experiences, I really started to understand how pervasive racism is for Black and brown people. And it impacted me so much that I helped co-found a nonprofit here in Atlanta called Future Foundation to support underinvested public schools so that children like me had an opportunity and they had support to graduate high school and go to some type of post-secondary institution. But even in that experience, I learned that racism followed me across industries, neighborhoods, and so much more. And so when I had the opportunity in 2020 to become the city's chief equity officer, I jumped at the opportunity because I believed that it was going to help fast track and advance my personal mission state of dismantling systems of injustice for people and communities with my lived experience. So I wanted to do this job right away. This work is my soul's work. And I cannot imagine, I can't remember a time that it has not been part of my life. So it's a calling, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you. Frank, tell us your story. What inspired you as a scholar, a researcher, an author to get in this space?
Well, as a child, I grew up partly in the South. I was born in Texas. We moved to Tennessee, and then I grew up in Boston in the end. And my parents, when we were in the South, I was small, but they were involved in the civil rights movement, going to demonstrations, taking me to the rallies. It seemed like they would get out of hand. And civil rights was what we talked about over the dinner table all the time. So by the time I was late in grade school, I was really following the news. I remember distinctly when Malcolm X was assassinated and Martin Luther King. It felt, and then of course the civil riots after that, it felt like the world was really going to change. It felt like we were on a path to a different world. And then my experience was that, of course, in the subsequent years, I saw the terrible busing crisis in Boston in those days, which was, Boston thought of itself as not a racist city, and it really showed itself to be pretty racist. And just growing up during that really shaped my view of what was important in society. So when I started graduate school at Stanford in 1980 in sociology, and Ronald Reagan was elected, and he just tried to turn back the clock on everything. Previous Republicans, even Nixon, had been pretty open. he really tried to turn the clock back, and I just saw progress stall. What seemed to be progress, I think we all saw in the 80s, just there was little talk about racial equity, little progress in the educational system, in the corporate world. So that really stimulated me I started studying diversity practices and what companies were doing in the 1980s to understand like what people were trying, and then it just frustrated me that some of the things that Professor Newkirk talks about in the book as the solution to this problem were so popular, like diversity training or the Rooney Rule, and didn't seem to be doing anything. So for the last 20 years, I've devoted myself to trying to study what works and what doesn't and why. So it was such a pleasure to read this book because it's so right on about everything, and it's so impressive how we see from one domain to the other, law, journalism, academia, the corporate world, there's been no progress. In academia, people are always telling me, it's better in the corporate world, it's better in law, it's better in journalism. It's a little better in the corporate world, but not much. So thank you for opening our eyes to the breadth of the problem.
And thank you for your compelling research, which I relied on as I was writing this book. I mean, I'm a journalist, so I turn to like people like you who really are doing God's by getting into the data and looking at these problems deeply, not just on the surface. So thank you. I was so excited when I understood that Frank Dobbin would be on this panel because from the time the book was published, I wondered, what would Frank Dobbin think?
We'll find out more about that, certainly. And thank you for kind of raising the door and opening the important observation in the book that across industries, academia, sports, the corporate world, the numbers and the statistics are quite sobering with where we are when it comes to diversity. And I was curious if there's a particular statistic or industry that stands out to you the most as being the most sobering when it comes to progress or lack of
Well,
progress.
they're also sobering. So I guess the biggest surprise for me, having been spent so much of my life in journalism and in academia, I knew what the numbers were. They're quite sobering. What I did not expect is that the numbers were so appalling across every field. Looking at the percentage of law partners, 1-2%, looking at, Hollywood, looking at the paucity of directors and the people behind the camera, looking at fashion, like no matter where I turned, the numbers were so bad that I had to keep going back over them to make sure I wasn't just hallucinating. They were just so unbelievable to me. And I think the biggest surprise was that the numbers in corporate America were so much better than the fields which are so purportedly progressive, like academia, like the arts, like Hollywood, like fashion. They are the worst when it comes to diversity. So that was like an unexpected finding.
Yeah. Andrew, what do you think about that? I mean, Pamela's suggesting that corporate America is doing better compared to some of these other spheres. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily surprised that, we have gaps in all industries, because it's a human problem, right? At the core of all this, I think what is keeping us from, not having things like diversity councils or talking about diversity all the time is that, when people are closed-minded, I think it's a closed-minded issue than it is more than anything else. When you don't have an open mindset for differences and either embracing them or trying to understand them, I think it shuts it down. So human nature tells you that there's going to be people that don't have that, and that's fine. I'm not judging anyone, just saying what it is. So it doesn't surprise me. What does surprise me, however, is that you're right. How many years we've been trying at this and we're just seeing small progress along the way. You know, how can we make this where we don't need a chief diversity officer in companies and in organizations? I don't know if we'll ever get to a place like that. Maybe the generation after Gen Z, maybe, because they'll have maybe a different mindset on things. But I do think that's a part that's really disappointing to see and hear, that it continues to be a challenge. I think companies that are trying to tackle that are trying to tackle it from a standpoint of not just, you know, a check the box, right? They're trying, we'll probably talk about that later, but I think the companies who are trying to get it done are the ones that are really focusing on the issue, the core heart, the root of the issue, and trying to see if you can open up people's minds and hearts. I don't think you can change it, but you can at least bring education and awareness to people to try to see if you can make it change. So not really a shocking thing. It's just, it's more of a disappointing and a sad thing than being surprised.
But Frank noted something that's really important for us to consider, that, you know, I'm a product of the Johnson's Great Society programs, right? You know, after the Civil Rights Movement, Johnson instituted all of these programs like that really addressed poverty and, you know, disadvantage and underrepresentation. And guess what? It moved the needle. African Americans, Latinos, Asians were for the first time walking through the doors of these companies and holding these positions that they had never held, right? And so we began to see true diversity flowering everywhere. And then, as Frank noted, Reagan came to power and began to dismantle all of the policies and programs that were responsible for this flourishing of diversity, right? And so we made monumental progress between the late 60s and the 80s, and then we saw many of the gains wiped away, erased. And so in the 90s, we're starting from ground zero. We're starting all over again, and in some instances, we are doing worse today than we were doing in 1990 and 1980. So that, talk about disappointing, right? But that has been the history of America, right? We had a civil war, then we had Reconstruction, and we had African American governors and senators, and then we had the Ku Klux Klan, and we had the Black Codes, and all the progress was erased. And then 100 years later, we did it again. We have the Civil Rights Movement. So this piece of the diversity puzzle, the resilience that's needed, how to sustain it is as much of a problem as getting it in the first place.
Yeah, so just sustaining it, and you're highlighting something important, and that is part of progress with an organization is influenced by what's happening in broader society outside of those organizations.
Right.
And Qaadirah, I was wondering if you could speak to that from a city perspective. One of the things you highlight, Pamela, in the book is the role of public education. And that is a segue to entree into universities and then in corporations. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about how you see that, some key initiatives maybe of the city of Atlanta that has helped progress us forward when it comes to beyond the organization.
So what's happening in corporate America is just an extension of what is happening in the greater community. And I'll provide a couple of different statistics that relate to Atlanta specifically. So Atlanta is number 3 in income inequality. Used to be number 1 last year. Atlanta is one of the hardest places in the country for children to find out poverty. Black households in Atlanta, 2.6 more times likely to experience food insecurity. Black youth, 7 times more likely to be disconnected than white youth. And yes, the quality of public education is a problem, The biggest problem is that our children are existing within families that are facing generational poverty. And so oftentimes, they may not have parents that can support them educationally. They might have parents that are working 24/7 just to make sure that their families are not food insecure. So, quality of public education, definitely a problem. But most importantly, our children need long-term, I call it long-term mentor support. They need help, people checking in to ensure that every year they transition to another grade, somebody says, did this particular child meet a certain standard? Their parents may not have the acumen to understand that, right? Teachers cannot do that for 85% of their class. Based on my experience, that's what's happening in under-invested schools. 85% of the children don't have support to understand that they're learning academically. So it's not necessarily poor education system. It is a support system that is needed beyond the school and teachers. It's going to take a village to reverse the quality of education, lack of education that's happening in our communities. You need support. Children need support. And that's going to come from business, nonprofit, and government working together, which leads to some of the initiatives that we are working on at the city. So one initiative is that we just reestablish the connection with Atlanta Public Schools. That partnership was in deficit. So we strengthened that partnership. I talked about income inequality earlier. One of the initiatives that we launched last year was a child savings account program to ensure that every kindergarten student in Atlanta Public Schools will receive $50 to start a savings account that can grow over time. Another project that we launched was a guaranteed income program. The city of Atlanta sold some real estate, and we were able to create a guaranteed income program to research and understand if we give residents $500 a month for 24 months, will that change the trajectory of poverty for that particular family? So we're researching and studying that particular initiative. And the last thing we're doing is we are identifying the communities in Atlanta that have historically been underinvested in. And we are ensuring that city resources, as well as our external partner resources, get to those communities. And we're using data to understand if we're moving the needle on how those particular communities are performing.
Great, thank you. I think you're highlighting the role of partnerships, and we've all been talking about data, which speaks to my heart very closely. Those of you know some of the things that I've been focused on, and that is gathering data and investigating those data points. Frank, I'm curious to understand from you, how important do you see it to look at the numbers for us to understand how organizations are doing in this space, and perhaps what else should we look at to assess how organizations are doing?
Well, to go back to the historical story, in the 60s and 70s, well, in the 70s and early 80s, most companies reported their progress on diversity every year in their annual affirmative action plan. Most companies, big companies that are federal contractors, have to write these. A lot of other companies wrote them anyway. But sometime in the 80s, companies started concealing their progress on these things. So instead of putting it out there that they've made no progress, which is what it often looked like, they usually with the advice of lawyers, they started concealing it, so we didn't know if companies were making progress. And I think what's problematic there is even their own managers didn't know if they were making progress because they concealed these reports from their own managers. They sent them to Washington, but they had an outside law firm put the report together, which showed at each job level basically the number of white, black, Asian American, Latinx, men and women, and also some other smaller groups in each of the 10 occupational categories. So this is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission report that they have to file annually, and they would produce goals. They'd not only say, here's where we are, but here's our goal. Suddenly nobody saw those goals, and nobody in the organization, much less external stakeholders, and nobody saw their plans for trying to change. So there's research showing that those were super effective in those years.
And can I just add to that there was a study of chief diversity officers at Fortune 500 companies, and like 65% of them did not have access to the numbers in their own workplaces. So you're shooting in the dark, right? Like, how do you fix the problem you cannot see?
Yeah.
And I also wanted to just note something that Qaadirah was saying, you know, about this disproportionate poverty and all of the, you know, educational strife that so many African Americans and other people of color experience. That said, the pipeline is not the reason why we don't have diversity. Frank, another amazing study he did, it showed that the pipeline just isn't a valid excuse for not having diversity anymore because of the large number of African Americans, Latinos, and others who have gone up through the educational system, right, have advanced degrees. So we can no longer say what we did in the 1960s, that, oh, we have a pipeline problem. It's why we can't do this.
That's a great point. And so how do you, I'm curious to hear from any of you, how do you respond to that pipeline is the reason why we lack diversity?
I direct them to Frank's work.
Tell us, how do you suggest we respond when we hear that response?
There are numbers,
Yeah,
right?
You do exactly what you talked about. You put the numbers in the face. I mean, and I'm not saying numbers are easy to get, but if you have some resources, you can get the right data and statistics to try to help you understand what the real issues are, whether it's the internal numbers or what's out there externally. So I think you fight that with the data. And most business leaders, that's the language they speak. The language is the numbers, right? So that's what we do. We put it back and say, hey, it's out there. That's not the problem. Let's go find the real problem.
Exactly.
Frank, do you want to
I would say the same thing. I think across sectors, in law firms, for example, if you look at the percentage of people getting JDs who are black or Hispanic, men and women, most people getting JDs now are women, but they are still not making it to partner in fancy law firms, even though that's been true for a while. Black lawyers tend not to be retained. They tend not to get entry-level jobs. Just putting the numbers before the people in the industry, I find it's true for academia as well. I mean, we have plenty to hide too. If you look discipline by discipline at the percentage of people, of blacks who are receiving PhDs, it way outnumbers the percent of who are receiving tenure-track positions or offers. So I think across industries, doing what you said, putting the numbers in people's face, makes them stop making the pipeline argument, because there's just no sector I know of where entry-level African Americans and Hispanics are not underrepresented, and Asian Americans too.
And I would add, data is important. We all know data is important. We're in a business school setting, and that's one of my major takeaways. Data, which is critical. But this work is also about courage and individual leadership and digging deep, going on a learning journey to understanding the internal and external data, and having the courage to disrupt the status quo.
I'm so glad you said that, because there's data that shows that people who hold the CEO role, there's a high turnover, and they're often afraid to confront the power, right? for good reason, because they
Absolutely.
often pay a penalty
Sure.
for telling the truth and for being the the one that's challenging the system. So it does take courage. It really is the role of someone who sees themselves as a change agent. That's a courageous person. If you're hiding under a desk, you should not be a CDO. You should find another position, because that is what the job calls for. You have to have the research, all the data, but you also have to have the courage, right? To highlight injustice where you find it.
Speaking of courage, let's talk about something beyond the numbers, and that's culture. Andrew, I know you've worked for a variety of corporations. Pamela, you talk about Coca-Cola and the journey to becoming a leader in this space. Andrew, I was curious if you could talk about the different cultures and some of the companies where you work, some of the similarities, differences, and how you see culture as a system for bolstering either individual courage, but also change in this space.
It's an interesting question, because I think culture is where it really matters, and almost if there is a chicken and egg when it comes to diversity and inclusion, I'd say that the chicken, if that's the first thing, it would be the culture. I think if you don't have an inclusive culture, I absolutely, and I've seen this in action, I think bringing in diversity can make it worse. How? Think about it this way, and I'm gonna throw a little brain science in there. I'm no neuroscientist, but I've worked with a lot of them. And when you think about having let's say just you have a homogeneous culture, and you now want to bring in diverse people into that culture, and most companies can do that, especially if you've got a good brand, you can bring folks in. But if the culture is one that excludes, all you're doing is basically bringing pain to those individuals that come into the company. How? The same neurons that light up when you experience physical pain in your mind today is the same neurons that light up when you're excluded. So think about it. You go into a culture that's exclusive and you don't feel like you belong. You're doing these mental gymnastics to try to stay in it and fight the things that are coming at you. So for me, I think the culture is the most important thing. You should start with that. I'm not saying that the diversity, which is the representation, doesn't matter. It's got to be an and. But if you have to start some way, it's got to be in the culture side of things to make sure that it's as inclusive as possible. And in terms of differences, in terms of companies I've worked for, I said it earlier, I think it's a human problem. So the problems haven't necessarily been the same. The business models change, the way a CEO operates change. But I think from a culture, from the issues and the culture component, the human nature says it's going to always be universal for the most part. You have nuances in countries and what have you, but I've seen the same thing. I think if there's any difference that I've seen, it's just how long you've been on the journey. So for Coca-Cola, for instance, they've been on a journey since 1999, even before that, in terms of
Since the
their-
landmark lawsuit.
Since that lawsuit in '99 forced them on the journey, and no one wants to be that. I got a lot of love for my Coke, so I'm not gonna say anything negative but I would say that when you're on the journey, depending on where you are on your journey, that's the difference I've seen. Like if you've just started, boy, there's a lot you've got to put down foundationally to make it work. If you're on it longer, there shouldn't be an excuse. You should be making progress, and it should be sustainable if you've been doing it for many years. So that's where I kind of give grace, depending on where I am and what I'm doing and what I'm focused on. I'm like, all right, my company it's brand new. DNI is brand new. We literally hired a CEO a year and a half ago, and we just stood up the office and are trying on it. At Coke, they've been in it for years. The company before that, Lennar, I worked with, they've never had diversity as a focus. So I think the problems are universal. The differences for me is outside of the business models, it's just, the maturity of the company when it comes to DNI.
And when it comes to culture, I mean, we have to remember that we live in a radically segregated society, that people don't have a comfort level, oftentimes, with people of color, not just like a natural comfort level. When you go into these homogenous workplaces, that is the way many people in this society live. They go to churches where everyone's white. They live in neighborhoods where everyone's white. They go to workplaces where everyone in the upper echelon of the institution is white. So that is a normalized state of being. Add to that the grapevine. how people learn about an opportunity. Well, if the grapevine is homogenous, it's not that these people are racist. The people who hear about these opportunities are people who are within earshot of that grapevine. So people of color often are just locked out of the grapevine. And then add to that the discomfort people have from not being accustomed to being around difference, right? You know, people at major companies have said that they don't speak to their Black colleagues because they don't know what to say. These are honest people who are just telling you the truth. Some of them work in HR. How does that work? How does that work? And you know, this one woman who worked in HR at a major bank said that she had worked there for 5 years, had never talked to her African-American colleagues because she didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to say, and I'm like, hello? But this is where we are, so we're trying to now plaster on this artificial diversity training, like it's like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, right? We're trying to fix something in a very superficial way that is deep. And so we have to look at this differently.
Yeah.
Because I think of some of the ham-handed ways that that companies have tried to superimpose diversity, for instance, in the newsroom. I remember the time when they would say they're looking for a Black reporter. Now, how does that work for white reporters? What do they say? Even if I'm the only African American working in the newsroom, but they're now looking for a Black reporter, so that means I got my job because I'm Black, even though I'm the only. Like, it's just a twisted logic, but it sets off the kind of resentment that Frank talks about in his research with even diversity training.
Yes, and let's go there. I'm very anxious to talk about that. So in your Harvard Business Review article, which I have assigned and I know others have as well, Why Diversity Programs Fail, you talk about mandatory bias reduction training. And not only that this training does not work, the research supports this, but these programs can actually create problems. Talk to us about why this is and then what institutions should do instead. And I often wonder why institutions continue to offer this kind of training.
Well, thanks for that question. I think we face a kind of macro problem about how we think about what's going on in the workplace and why we don't have more diversity. And the macro problem is we think that the issue is just in people's heads. That is, if we could just get rid of bias in people's heads, that would fix everything. But as Pamela was, Professor Newkirk was just suggesting, it's all about who you know. I mean, networks matter. A lot of other things matter, and that we could actually change directly. We can change the networks people have by mentoring programs, by recruitment programs, by how we mix up training. We can address that. We can't change bias in people's heads, and Pamela beautifully cites the work of Halleck and Donald Green, studying almost 1,000 studies of a meta-analysis of almost 1,000 studies of diversity training, and none of them find that you can significantly change people's bias through any kind of bias training for any extended period of time.
At
None of
best
them.
lasts a day, the few that they found.
You're lucky if it lasts a day, exactly. So, but we keep thinking if we could only change bias in people's heads and we send them to diversity training. So what we see in our research on different kinds of diversity training, we're looking not at like whether people like the training or whether their bias has been reduced. We're looking at if a company puts in one kind of diversity training, 5 years later, are managers more diverse? Right. Now, if you're not looking at that, I'm sorry, but you're not looking at the right thing. Because what do we care about? You know, we don't care about, you know, frontline workers more diverse, that's a start. But can you get managers to be more diverse? And in fact, the most common form of training in most companies, well, in all companies, is anti-bias training for managers that's coupled with legalistic content. So the anti-bias training is designed to prove to you that you're biased, which does not go down well with you. The other component, the legalistic part, is to tell you what you can't say or do anymore, which proves to you that you have been practicing discrimination. So that has negative effects. It actually reduces the race, gender, ethnic diversity of the managerial workforce in our study of 8 million workers over 30 years and 800 companies, leads to significant decreases. What we do see, though, is there are some ways to do training better. One way to do training better is to, for managers, offer cultural inclusion training that isn't about blaming them,
Right.
but is about training them how they can be better managers, how they can be more inclusive by practicing empathy, by understanding what it would be like to be the one person from your group in this newsroom. And we see that when they only get that kind of training, none of the legalistic stuff, there are significant increases in managerial diversity five years later. So that can actually have some positive effects. But to be honest, when we look at all different kinds of diversity programs, a mentoring program beats any kind of diversity training program, hands down. Because it's trying to fix the thing that's wrong, which is that people don't get people from underrepresented groups are not getting mentors, they're not getting sponsorship, they're not getting help in their careers, exactly because they don't have the networks, the grapevine, as you said.
Great, thank you for highlighting that work and those important findings. I really take that in.
And did you also find that 5 years after these mandatory training sessions, the percentage of Black women and Asian women and men actually went down? The percentage of women and Asians in management, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, because it goes to the point made earlier that, when you try to go after, you're not focusing on the inclusive, the belonging culture component you're trying to do, throwing diversity at it doesn't fix it necessarily. You need to do a lot more. You gotta fix the culture. You gotta fix, things like the behaviors around mentoring and sponsoring that you talked about. By the way, I want to thank you because, that article, and I didn't even realize that you wrote it until today. I'm trying to read it and you don't really think about the author, but it saved my butt a couple times.
You need to think about authors.
I'm better going forward. But I remember speaking to sharing that with the CEO and his board, that article, game changer.
Yes.
Because what most leaders are looking for, they look, it's not that talking about diversity and inclusion is certainly can be uncomfortable for many. But what most leaders are trying to get at is, what do I do? And so this is what we do, Andrew. And then that article, that case study won it for me.
Right.
And I appreciate you for that. So it's doing its job.
So everyone go read that.
Yeah.
It's worth the read.
Yeah, and it's cited in my book too, because it really was a groundbreaking study, and it just disrupted this whole narrative, right? Not that companies stopped doing it.
Right.
But now you have the evidence to call them out on, right?
Yeah.
You could say, oh, come on.
Yeah.
Like, this has been studied and we know that this is bogus.
Qaadirah, I'd like to ask you about something, switching gears a little bit. Pamela, in your book, in talking about Coca-Cola, you describe their contribution at one point in time to a number of high-profile Black causes in the community, yet at the same time, their workforce was bifurcated such that at the lower levels, we saw more Black and historically underrepresented employees, and at the higher levels, we saw a composition that was still primarily white and male. And so when you think about creating an equitable and diverse workforce within the company, relative to advocating for social equity outside of the company. How do you think about those two? And if a company can only do one, what should a company do? Or an organization more broadly?
Wow.
I'm glad you got that
We're gonna keep you.
And so you can help me answer this question. But I will start, by saying that companies hire employees. Companies operate in communities. So they have an obligation to support their employees internally. And they have an obligation to improve communities as well. So I don't think you can just choose one, right? And I'll tell you why this matters. So our demographics tell us that by 2040, the majority of population will be Black and brown. That is a huge cultural shift. And the companies and the cities that start understanding now how to culturally change to support that shift will be the most competitive. And we see it happening a little bit now. We had a major event, double pandemic, a lot of people in vulnerable communities died. We had social unrest across the world. And as a result of that, we are seeing fallout like Great Resignation. That is vulnerable people, Black and brown people speaking and saying that this culture is not supporting us. So if we don't start to shift now, we aren't going to be competitive cities and competitive companies. So it matters that we start thinking about what we're all talking about today, these solutions that are critical for companies and communities.
Can I just add that the way Coca-Cola was able to disrupt the systemic bias that had been the rule of the day forever there, in the lawsuit it found that African Americans were paid less than their white peers even in the same role, that they had fewer opportunities for advancement, that they had worse evaluations, that statistics like should not have shown such a skewed disparity, and on and on. The way that Coca-Cola was able to disrupt that was to have transparent metrics. So someone went in and they looked at people of color across the board, every position they were in. They looked at every position and they looked at how people fared according to race, according to gender, the disparity in salaries. So all of those things showed up. They could see these patterns of bias that had metastasized. And only when they could see it could they go about dismantling those systems of injustice. So, and they did it over a 5-year period. The percentage of women and African Americans in management, along with other people of color, dramatically increased, right? So this took intention, it took will, it took transparent metrics, it took leadership. It's not going to happen without any of those things. But what we find in the Coca-Cola case is that it also takes vigilance, because 20 years later, guess who is not faring as well again? African Americans, who were the original plaintiffs, right, in that landmark lawsuit. So we can make progress and we can also lose ground.
Sure. And that's a
without
theme
vigilance.
that I'm hearing, and that's
Yeah.
the sustainability and ability to make consistent progress over time.
And I think the thing that's also important to point out is that, this is continuously happening across industries over time. This is deeply entrenched into our institutions, deeply entrenched. So it can't just happen with, change can't happen with a company just saying, I want to change it internally. You got to focus on the internal and the external. It's critical. You have to throw everything, all your resources at this problem, or we are not going to be competitive.
So we're back to systems and partnerships, which is what we talked about earlier. Frank, I'd like to ask you about a very specific program or intervention. Pamela, you talk about this in your book, and that's the Rooney Rule. So in the NFL, there's a rule currently where teams must interview at least 2 candidates of color when they're hiring for a head coach. So I'm curious, what's your assessment of this rule? Is it effective? Do you think this type of rule should be implemented in other organizations across other industries?
Well, I mean, I think the book gives a pretty clear answer to that question, and it's not a popular answer to that question because I happen to know Cyrus Mary, the lawyer who negotiated this rule, and he's done fantastic work, including, I think he won $172.5 million from Coca-Cola, if my math is right. So he and Johnny Cochran, as Professor Newkirk just beautifully detailed in the book, they got the NFL by threatening a lawsuit to accept a rule that Dan Rooney, who is a team owner, I think, proposed, which is the rule that eventually they ended up with, is they have to interview 2 black people for the position of head coach. And they've, some other positions are now subject to that rule, and we saw very quick progress in hiring black coaches, but of course.
From 2 to 8 in a very short time.
Yeah, and
now I think we're back down to 2.
so that's the key. So the rule is still there, though we have regressed, and this goes to your point about we regress. So to me, it looks like this is what happened. There was a lot of noise about the NFL, and owners felt they were under great pressure. So they adopted this rule, but then as soon as people were looking the other way, they just went back to doing what they were doing before.
And it has no teeth, right? So you could pull any 2 black people or people of color out and say, I'm interviewing you.
And I mean, Pamela
And that's all, and that's all you had to do.
in the book, that it's clear that they circumvent the rule, they choose somebody, and then they decide they're going to interview 2 black people afterward. And of course, some cases have come to light recently. So, and I think this goes to a bigger problem with how we think about trying to change culture. Making a rule that you have to interview 2 black candidates, which, by the way, a lot of companies do now too, as Professor Newkirk points out in the book, is not the right approach, because it's not changing the culture, it's not changing people's networks, it's not changing how you really promote people. It's just a mandate. And it's a mandate that implies that the people who are doing the hiring and promotion are bigots. So you're immediately tarnishing these people with an X. You're bigots, so we have to treat you like children. And I think it's just the wrong approach. You need to bring people on board. And we see with other rules, like a lot of companies in the 80s and 90s put in mandatory job tests for managers. And a lot of companies that, like consultancies, law firms, corporations, when they do interviews, they do kind of an internal test in the interview. They'll have like an embedded math test, for example. And in our research, we see that those backfire. That is, companies that try to rely on tests to force managers to hire the person who has the best test score, they don't look at the test scores. They figure out a way to get around them. So one of the common things that managers do is they tell their friend they got the job, And then they have 4 other people who they don't want to hire take the test.
Exactly.
And then they're not required, there's no transparency. They're not required to tell HR who did badly on the test or tell the people why they didn't get the job. So we see when companies do that, a significant, start to use these managerial job tests, a significant decline in manager diversity in the subsequent 5 or 10 years. And why is that? Well, you've pissed them off again instead of trying to bring them on board. And they figured out a way to beat your rule. You know, it's like when your 5-year-old figures out a way to beat the rule.
It's only as good as the goodwill of the people who
Totally,
are in leadership, right?
totally.
I think where we have seen it work though, Frank, is when you add another element to the Rooney Rule. And so in the companies I worked for, the other element was not only diverse slate of candidates, but diverse interview panels. And it couldn't, in one particular company, the hiring manager could not have his direct reports or her direct reports as part of that panel. It had to be someone outside of their function, their division.
And that's what Coca-Cola did,
Yeah,
actually.
and-
There was a overview kind of
Right,
committee that
right.
looked at, you know, just the seriousness of the search.
Right,
And like
right.
who you brought in, were
They
they
looked
really the qualified people?
Right.
Yeah,
To
so,
try to eliminate that natural bias that we all have. And I think I've seen that work. Now, the sustainability of that, you're right, comes and goes because it depends if that diverse hire does well. And in the piece I talked about earlier about diversity can make it worse if the culture isn't great, because that diverse hire might be very skilled and capable, but if the culture is toxic and exclusive, they're gonna quit. And what happens to the hiring manager? See, I gave it a shot, they didn't work out. So now they'll never hire a diverse person again. You've now started a perpetual cycle that you can't get out of because you've now ruined the mindsets of these hiring managers because you haven't fixed the core issue.
So we've talked a bit about what happens at the organizational level in terms of leaders, what is happening at the community level. I'd like to get your thoughts a little bit on what individuals can do to be change agents. So we've got students, faculty, staff who are emerging leaders. And they may or may not step into formal roles where they can change the culture, change the organization initially. And Pamela, you described some examples in your book of change agents, which I think are quite interesting. So there was a story of April Rain who turned on the TV to watch the Oscar nominees, and her actions started a movement and some change. What are some informal
Oscar,
things?
so she started the hashtag Oscar So White, which highlighted the paucity of people of color nominated. She had all the facts and figures about how many years have passed since there has been African American, Latino, Asian nominees of color.
Mhm.
So yeah.
So what are some other things that individuals can do to be change agents within their organizations or communities or the spaces?
There was a
They
quote in the
find
book
themselves?
about people who have power, I'm not gonna quote it exactly, but people who have power need to rock the boat. And oppressive structures are often about power. So I would encourage you, wherever you are in your career, to examine your power level. And then think about ways, this is very provocative, I say this sometimes and people are like, but examine ways that you can start giving away your power. And that's gonna build an empathy muscle and regulate your power. You can do things like, you can start with your children. You can understand how you give them more opportunities to make decisions. You can relinquish control of meetings and let other people lead those meetings. You can open your network and give somebody who is not in your network access to it. Talked a lot about that today, that's so critical. Money is power. Are you giving money back to marginalized communities? When there's an equal distribution of power, that's how we all thrive together.
And the problem is that the most vulnerable people are the ones who are often left to do that work, right? The work for which they could easily lose their job. These are the people, the majority of chief diversity officers are people of color, women, or members of the LGBTQ community, right? So you put the most vulnerable people in a position that has to take on the power. And I'm not saying they should not have that job. I'm just saying that there's this imbalance. And so what Qaadirah is suggesting is that the people who have the power are the ones who need to be looked upon to do something with their power, right?
We all have power,
Yeah, absolutely.
we all. And so as we collectively start to organize and distribute our power, we all have a role to play in that collective power. And we gotta start examining how we give some of it away.
What can I do?
Yes.
I love that, a really simple approach that I coach my daughter on quite a bit as well, is just the mindset, right? My mom used to say, if you look for a problem, you'll find it. I'm Jamaican, so, you know, it's throwing a little pothole out there, but you look for a problem, you'll find it. So I think, you know, when she was kind of coming up, and she's still, you know, early in career right now, trying to figure things out, but she had a bit of a mindset, and I don't think she minded me sharing this, but that there's gonna be an issue with me working for someone who's doesn't look like me. And so when you look for it, a lot of times your mind is gonna find it. We were having lunch today with some of your students, and we were talking about that mindset, that sometimes you go into it and you're expecting this very specific outcome, instead of being open-minded to whoever is in the room in front of you, whoever is one-on-one, and being more open to that individual. So I think every single person can practice more open-mindedness and check where that is. It's not about you checking your bias. We all know we have it, fine. And you're right, we can't cure bias. Bias is in you, but you can educate and build your own awareness. So I think it starts first with, where are you? You know, what do you know about this whole diversity story and what it's about? So get educated. We're in an education facility. You should educate yourself about what diversity is, what it means. I've been reading some of the stuff on your website. You have some great stuff in terms of, you know, how you define diversity, how you define inclusion and equity. You've got a lot of programs. Read up on that. Make sure that you're square first before you go out and challenge anyone else, no matter whether you're diverse or not. So I think that's a small thing that I think people can do.
Yeah, great, thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to say, I did say earlier that we can't train away bias, but we can definitely reduce people's bias, but it's through their experiences. It's not through a 1 hour online training where you're trying to click through to get to the final.
Yeah, because like if you have reading groups like this, no one's making you read Diversity Inc. And because if they did, you'd be like so annoyed, right? But if it's voluntary, right, that is a way that you actually can see change, right? In the way people, in someone's outlook on something, if it's not mandated.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to open the floor to questions from the audience. We have a microphone here in the center, so please make your way to the microphone with your questions. We want to hear from you. Some of the informal feedback I received is that our students are really keeping the panelists on their toes, asking tough questions. So we would love to hear from you, so please make your way to the microphone and ask questions.
Yeah, nothing soft.
Brilliant students from earlier. Ask them.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jayla Hawkins. I'm a member of the inaugural Master of Analytical Finance program here at Goizueta. Thank y'all. So I know we've spoken extensively about the necessity to do the work that's going to create equitable, diverse, and inclusive workspaces. But I wanted to pose a question to you specifically, Ms. Qaadirah. Could you just kind of speak more about how your experience has been shaped as you were the first in your role? So specifically some of those challenges or burdens that you may have overcame, and then how do you work to navigate them?
It's a great question. Someone said, I think it might have been you, Andrew, talking about the mental gymnastics that you have to do. One of the things that I think is important for people to understand doing this work, and even if you have an informal role, is that this work is tough. I often refer to myself as a social justice gladiator because I have to work out in various capacities, because these experiences from an educational standpoint, from a workplace standpoint, are traumatic. I mean, I had a funder ask me, when are we going to have to stop taking care of Black people, Qaadirah? Wow. And you have to sit there and bring about understanding in those type of conversations. So lots of trauma. And the way I continue to find hope is through conversations like these, continued learning, and making sure I'm well. So I would just say that it's a journey. It's hard. Know what's going to happen on the outset, and prepare yourself to be well as you go through these types of experiences. And surround yourself with mentors and a board of directors that you can go to and be supported. Thank you. Absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn. Contact me because I like to open my network. I understand the importance of it.
May I ask it? I'm
And
sorry.
Sure, please.
The only thing I can add to what you said so amazingly, is you have to find joy in your life. That you may have this fight for the rest of your life, right? But you also have to have joy, right?
Yes.
Go to a museum, go to listen to music, like do other things. Like this cannot be the all-consuming thing in your life. It cannot be. It should not be.
Hello, everybody. My name is Deshaun Adams, and I am an evening MBA student here at Goizueta. My question is actually for any of you all who would like to answer this question. So I currently work full-time as a DEI strategist at a tech company, which will remain nameless just for this conversation, but really had an opportunity over the last couple of years to work even at a consulting firm, really helping CDOs and others shape the strategy around like what should they be doing in DEI. The question that I have is less about me and more about sort of how do we build coalitions, either within organizations or within industries, to really get at some of the power structures that are in place. So through you all's research, I'd say, don't do the things that you outlined, Professor Dobbin, in terms of why DEI programs fail. And a lot of times,
That is
people,
the shortest answer to
yeah,
have.
that's my new answer. And I think the other part of it is, people sort of ask questions at the organizational level. How do we do it? How should we shape our programs? I think the way that you sort of structured a lot of the questions, Professor Newkirk, is a lot of the questions that, a lot of leaders are grappling with. So I know I said a lot, but the TLDR is how do you build coalitions to actually transform power structures?
TLDR?
Too long, did not read. Sorry, that is a tech word as well. Long story short.
I love it.
I mean, one of the things that people working in the DEI space need to do is their research, right? So when people say, as they often do, oh, we can't find any, you need an answer to that. You should find them. You should find the diversity. You should have a long list of perspectives that you can always tap into across positions, right? Particularly in the areas where people of color, particularly Blacks and Latinos in tech, are so radically underrepresented, even though they keep going to school for engineering, computer science. So, in many of these tech organizations, if they only went to the Ivy Leagues, if they only recruited at MIT, Harvard, all of these business schools, they could change it overnight. So you have to call out the hypocrisy and also maybe some of it is just ignorance. People are still relying on those dated responses, the pipeline, it's the pipeline, it's the pipeline. No, it's not. No, it's not. So that would be my response, because to me, that's as important, maybe more important than building these coalitions. Like, coalitions are good for like your support and for what Qaadirah is saying, like working on your mental health and like being with people so you're not crazy. That's great. But I'm talking about disrupting these patterns of bias. You need to have a strategy. How do you do that? You need to have your numbers, and then you need to know where to find talent. That's all around. So anytime someone tells me they can't find any, I don't believe them. I just don't. In a city like Atlanta, you can't find diversity. In a city like New York, in a city like, and on. It's not true. It means you're not looking. You're waiting for it to come floating up from
Or they don't want to
somewhere.
work there,
Or-
because they know the culture.
Right.
Mr. Adams, I think it's an interesting point around coalitions, and I agree with you. I think, sure, it has its place, and you should try to find those avenues, and most companies and industries kind of have that together. I think the most important thing I would be asking myself, if you haven't already, is where does your CEO stand on it? Because it starts with, we talked about this once, right?
Leadership.
It's commitment at the top. If it doesn't start there, this is not a bottom-up. Diversity inclusion is not a bottom-up exercise. You said it earlier, it is top-down for real. And if your CEO and the C-suites, the leadership team that's below them, don't have a voice in this and aren't telling you where they stand, the efforts will fail over time. That's probably why we're seeing this, roller coaster. Because a new CEO comes in, they got a different mindset, they're focused on something else, it's there. So I think it's that, and it's also what I said earlier, which is just give them the blueprint. The good thing is that there are some blueprints out there you can follow. They want to know what to do, but diversity sometimes can feel very complicated and hard to achieve. But the good thing is that there's blueprints, there's books written, there are case studies. Follow the blueprint, and make sure that the CEO not only has a voice, is the voice. I tell CEOs this all the time. You should not be the face of diversity in your company. It should be your CEO. Sorry. I mean, it's just because it doesn't have, not that it doesn't have you don't have the power. The voice of the CEO will matter more just because
Yes.
we all know why in everything. And it's not just about diversity, it's about strategy, about anything you do. So I would focus on making sure the CEO has a voice and is sharing that voice with the employees, because that's what's going to try to move the needle.
Because a diversity problem is a leadership problem. That is where you need to look.
Yeah.
When you have a diversity problem, leadership.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
So I think we're going to make that the last question. I would like to end on a positive note. And I wondered if anyone who would like to remark on some of the things that you see Emory or Goizueta doing well in this space.
That I can't answer, but I can say what Andrew, to amplify what he just said, that the good news is that there are successful models, that no one should have to recreate a wheel. There are models all around, and any institution that's serious about diversity can replicate a successful model. Coca-Cola is just one of many to look at as a way to change the landscape in your company or in your institution.
I thought our equity strategic planning process was amazing. I thought that it was very comprehensive and that it involved a wide range of stakeholders, including students, professors, external community partners that provided a lot of feedback. I thought it was wonderful. I also visited the Hatchery Center last week, which is Emory's Innovation Center. If you have not visited that particular center, you should go. There is a lot of cross-school collaboration and insights happening around entrepreneurship and how you support the ecosystem for founders and entrepreneurs that supports equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think that's amazing. I think some of this work is about innovation and research and exploring creative ways to be inclusive, diverse, and support inequities. So I love the Hatchery Center.
Thank you for mentioning that. I really like that intersection of creativity, innovation, and diversity. That speaks to me very strongly. So I thank the panel.
Can I just say one quick thing about, it can't be alone and not talk about my school.
If it's positive.
Out of this one, Frank.
Absolutely. I'm glad we're ending on a high note because, by the way, let's not lose hope, team. I mean, there's been some progress. We know there's been a bit of a roller coaster and a whack-a-mole going on in terms of how we chase this thing, but there is progress and there's plenty of hope, and the hope is in the eyes that I see in the space. And so what I'd say is you guys are doing well is even just having this here, these conversations. I think you should turn into action. So you shouldn't just talk about it, like I said, be about it. So do something with whatever nugget you took away today. Find one thing you're going to do differently. I'll say that. But as far as what I've seen, when you look at the first thing I think people look at when they're thinking about either becoming a student or working on staff here is what's the message. And so if you go and you actually just search diversity in Emory University, it shows that there's a D&I office. Check. It shows that you have a mission statement and a mantra. Check. It shows that you have a mission, vision, and pieces around it. Check. Great. When you look at kind of the diversity stats that you post. Wow, can't believe that. You've got it out there. Some of it not that great. We all know that. Got some work to do.
You're supposed to be positive. Positive.
But real. Positive but real. I'm all about that. But I think you have, a good mix of initiatives and strategies that you're trying to really do and drive. And I love these conversations that you're doing. Don't stop them. Continue to focus on it. Continue to have a lot of things in the pot, but keep it strategic. Right, Professor Cassandra, you got to keep it strategic. And so as long as you're doing that and driving those things, I think you're well on your way. And by the way, look at this room. Not too shabby in terms of the diversity in this room, right? You guys are doing that diversity in every element and the ones we don't see too, because diversity is also invisible. We don't know what your story is and what you're going through. So, keep living into that. There's plenty of hope out there.
Great. So don't just talk about it, be about it.
That's right.
Love that. So I'm going to turn the program back over to Allison Case for a moment.
I'll just squeeze by here. Well, thank you guys all again for attending, and thank you so much to our panelists. This was fantastic. I loved every minute of it. We just have a small thank you gift for each of you to take home with you. Thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you guys don't know, many of our panelists traveled from out of state to be with us today, so we are especially grateful for your time. And I'd like to hand it over to Dean James to close it out for us.
Thank you. Well, let me start by thanking the panel and Jill for a fascinating discussion. Since I only arrived this summer, this is my first chance at experiencing the Common Read. I understand this is the third time it's been held, but the first time in person. I don't know why it wasn't in person the first two times, but almost 150 people signed up for this, and a fair proportion of them seem to be in the room or online here today. So congratulations on that. I loved a lot of the discussion. The idea of giving away power was great. If as dean I had any power, I'd be very interested in doing that. And the idea of having joy in whatever you do. Unfortunately, I'm a dean, but I think those are all fantastic points. But on a serious note, I mean, I think, within academia itself, a lot of the points that you were raising about the challenges in an industry setting apply exactly the same within our setting here. And some of the discussion on sort of, should you have forced interview panels and forced sort of people that you interview. Again, a lot of universities have had those exact same discussions and frankly failures in trying to implement that. The concept of having a broader panel of people that are actually doing the evaluation, that really resonates with me. It's often challenging in an environment if you don't have that diversity to start with, but it can be achieved, I think, and I really do think that resonates with me as well in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So thank you all. I understand that we have a feast, is it? A feast outside. And this is an academic feast, so it's more theoretical than practical. But, please do join us, and I'm looking forward to further discussion outside. So again, thank you all.